Paris, summer of 1572. The sky wasn't kissed by sunset, it burned blood-red under the blaze of torches. Church bells thundered from every tower, not to summon God, but to sound a call to war that echoed over ancient cobblestones. And yet, before the Seine ran red, before vows turned to screams, before love became a trap, there was only a wedding, lavish, glorious, and cursed. Catherine de Medici sat veiled in black, her eyes watching, always watching. The Queen Mother of France, a woman whose name stirred fear and fascination in equal measure, was now the architect of unity, at least in appearance. Her son, King Charles IX, pale and nervous, presided over a kingdom cracking beneath the weight of religious tension. Catholics and Huguenots had been slaughtering each other in the name of God for years. France was not a country, it was a tinderbox. To heal it, or perhaps to contain it, Catherine offered a marriage, her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre. It was a political union of ice and fire. Huguenot leaders, including Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, had arrived in Paris under a fragile royal promise of safety. But safety in Catherine's world was a coin with two faces. She was no stranger to blood. Born a Medici in Florence, she had survived sieges, betrayals, and the death of her husband, Henry II of France, whose eye had been pierced during a Giustiz's brain, slowly dying as she prayed beside him. Now she ruled not as queen, but as regent, through her son-sweet kings Aland, especially Charles, who shook and stammered under her gaze. Catherine whispered counsel into the ears of children and commanded the room from behind a veil. Her enemies called her the Italian Serpent. Her allies called her Madame la Serpente. The snake title stuck either way, but even the snake feared her prey. Admiral Coligny had grown close to King Charles II, close. The Protestant leader, seasoned and charismatic, now walked the halls of the Louvre with confidence, even daring to speak privately with the king alone. Catherine noticed. Charles began to speak of war against Catholic Spain, a campaign Coligny strongly favored. For Catherine, this was a nightmare. France was fragile, and a war would crack it in two. Worse still, she was losing her grip on her son. She needed Charles pliant, afraid, and hers not Coligny's. And so, something shifted. The gears of history ground forward, quiet at first. On the 22nd of August, just days after the wedding, a musket fired from a window on the Rue de Béthissy. The bullet tore into Coligny's hand and shoulder. It missed his heart, but not his fate. The city held its breath. Who had ordered the hit? The king's guards? The Guise family, Coligny's enemies? Or was it Catherine herself, moving unseen behind veils and rosaries? Paris had no answers, only suspicion. The Protestant nobles, incensed, demanded justice. The Catholic nobles whispered of revenge, and Catherine, stoic, unreadable, tightened the noose. Coligny, wounded and bandaged, returned to his lodgings near the Louvre. The streets were boiling with rumor. Protestants feared for their lives. Catholic militia began to gather in silence. And behind palace walls, Charles IX broke sweating, shaking, panicked. He had been pushed too far. "I will have them all killed," he reportedly screamed. "Kill them all, so that not one remains to reproach me." And just like that, the veil lifted. Catherine, who for years had balanced court factions like a juggler with knives, now dropped them all to the floor. The slaughter was no longer a whisper, it was a command. By nightfall, Catholic assassins were slipping through alleyways, armed and ready. Bells rang across the city not in celebration, but in signal. The wedding had become a trap. The blood that would follow would not be spilled in battle but in bedrooms. And at the heart of it all stood Catherine de Medici, mother, queen, and now, as some would later call her, the Butcher of Paris. The hour was just before dawn. Paris slept fitfully, as if sensing the weight of what was coming. But in the halls of the Louvre, where blood had once mixed with wine, steel was being unsheathed. Orders whispered by men in black doublets passed from chamber to courtyard, from noble to killer. No proclamations were made, no banners raised, only the bells. They rang from the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, not for prayer, not for joy. They rang as a signal. Across the city, doors were kicked open. Protestant nobles, guests at the royal wedding just days earlier, were dragged from their beds in silk and nightclothes. They were thrown onto cobbled streets and butchered like animals. No trial, no mercy. The first to die was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Still recovering from the failed assassination, he lay in bed, unable to rise. He heard them coming, boots on stairs, blades drawn, a door splintering. A man named Bem, a German Catholic in service to the Duke of Guise, burst into the room. Coligny looked exhausted, his body failing him, his faith not. "Young man," he is said to have whispered, "you should respect these grey hairs." Bem ran him through with a sword. Then, in a moment of grotesque theatre, Coligny's corpse was thrown from the window. It landed in the street below, where a mob mutilated it, cutting off his hands, castrating him, and parading the remains like a trophy. It was the 24th of August, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day. From that moment on, Paris transformed into a city of blood. Catholic citizens, fueled by hate and hysteria, joined the purge. Women were dragged by their hair into the gutters. Children were slaughtered in the arms of their mothers. The saint turned red. By order, at least silent consent of the crown, the slaughter was sanctioned. Inside the Louvre, Henry of Navarre, the groom himself, was trapped. A Protestant prince newly wed into the royal family, he now stood at the edge of a blade. He was dragged before King Charles IX and given a choice: convert to Catholicism or die. Henry chose life. He recited the Mass. He mouthed the words. Whether his heart believed them or not, none could say. But Catherine watched silent, unreadable as her new son-in-law renounced his God. And Margarethe, a bride, barely 17, had awoken to the sounds of screams. According to her own memoirs, she opened her chamber door and saw a man covered in blood, sword in hand. It was not a nightmare. It was history. She screamed for help, for reason, for her brother to stop the madness. None came. Days passed. The killing spread beyond Paris to Orléans, Lyon, Rouen, Bordeaux. Across France, the massacre unfolded like a plague. By some estimates, as many as 10,000 Protestants were killed in the weeks that followed. Catherine de Medici did not shed a tear. She walked the halls of the Louvre, eyes always watching, always calculating. She justified the killings as necessary. France needed unity. France needed cleansing. France needed silence. But whispers grew. Europe was watching. Pope Gregory XIII, upon hearing the news, ordered a Te Deum sung in celebration at St. Peter's Basilica. A medal was minted in Rome to honor the massacre. To some, Catherine was a savior of the Catholic faith. To others, she was a monster. The woman who had once offered her daughter in marriage to bridge a nation had, in the eyes of many, used the wedding as bait. And her son, King Charles IX, was no longer pale. He was haunted. Witnesses later recalled how he wandered the halls muttering, unable to sleep, unable to eat. "What blood, what murders," he was heard whispering. "What evil counsel I have followed." And still Catherine stood by him, her hand on his shoulder, her shadow always behind. In the weeks following the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Paris fell into a grotesque silence, not the peace of reconciliation, but the hush of exhaustion of a city bled dry by its own hands. Streets once choked with corpses now stank of rot and resentment. The Seine, which had carried away thousands of bodies, moved sluggishly, as if in mourning. King Charles IX did not leave his chambers. He wandered the corridors of the Louvre at night, murmuring to himself, sometimes shrieking at unseen ghosts. The royal physician noted that his hands trembled constantly. He refused food. He bled from the nose for days. His bed was soaked in sweat each morning. Witnesses reported that he screamed in his sleep cries of blood, more blood, and the names of those he had once called friends. The boy king had committed regicide by proxy, and it had shattered what little remained of his innocence. Catherine de Medici, however, remained composed to the world. She emerged from behind her veil, unshaken, attending councils, writing letters, negotiating alliances. But behind closed doors, even she could not silence the rot spreading through her kingdom. The massacre had achieved temporary control, but not peace. The Protestants, humiliated and hunted, retreated to their strongholds. The Catholics, emboldened and blood-soaked, now saw themselves as saviors. France was more divided than ever. And yet, Catherine kept moving her pieces. She placed her youngest son, the Duke d'Anjou, on the ballot to be King of Poland. She negotiated with the Vatican, which praised her as a defender of the faith. Her daughter, Marguerite, still married to the traumatized Henry of Navarre, was summoned back into court society with a mask of forced grace. But even Catherine could not control the disease festering inside her firstborn son. By 1573, Charles IX was coughing blood. He barely spoke. The boy who once played with hunting dogs in the gardens now shivered beneath wool blankets, paranoid and skeletal. Physicians prescribed tinctures and prayers. Nothing worked. According to one courtier, Charles once demanded that his windows be nailed shut because he feared the spirits of the murdered would fly in to claim him. He was not wrong. The massacre had cursed the Valois name. While foreign ambassadors still bowed, their letters described the French court as a kingdom of shadows. Every gift brought to court, be it fruit, meat, or cloth, was suspected of being poisoned. Every whispered laugh was thought to be treason. And yet, Catherine persisted. She ruled in her son's name as his health declined. She orchestrated diplomacy while tending to his sickbed. But even Sheth, serpent queen of rumor, could not weave a spell strong enough to save her heir. On May 30th, 1574, Charles IX died. He was only 23 years old. His lungs, blackened and torn from infection, could no longer draw breath. His blood refused to clot. His final words, if they are to be believed, were not addressed to his mother or his God, but to the ghosts. "What have I done?" At his funeral, the bells rang not in celebration, but in dread. There were no riots, no cheers, only the hollow stillness of a kingdom unsure of itself. The crowds lined the streets, silent, weary. They stared at the black drapes and did not weep. They remembered. And what of Catherine? She wore mourning black as always. But there was no trembling in her hands, no red in her eyes. She buried her son and kept walking. France still needed a ruler. The throne passed to her next son, Henry, the Duke of Anjou, who would return from Poland to rule as Henry III. But even as a new king rose, the whispers continued that Catherine had planned it all from the beginning, that the wedding was always a trap, that the blood in the saint had not been spilled for faith, but for power. Catherine never answered her critics. She did not need to, for in the court of French history, her silence was louder than any confession.